This is the nameless protagonist. This morning, I decided to try something a little bit different since I noticed things were a little bit slow in the space. Oftentimes, I wake up early and I don't consider perhaps how much I do in a very condensed amount of time. And oftentimes, my thoughts are free to flow in a state of consciousness to various things. Many of these things I take for granted, I suppose, and I guess this is more of an experiment. I'd like to ultimately share what's generally on my mind. Some of the things that consist of predispositions that my thoughts take whenever you see me in the space or in panels or whatever content I decide to create. For the most part, this is where my mind resides, things that I consider deeply. In this spirit, then, what is useful, I encourage you to take. What is not useful, feel free to discard until such a time that it may be useful, either for yourself or others you may know. But we'll go ahead and open up things. Firstly, to the founders of the space, os. To those of you who have joined me or will join in the chat, and those on the replay, os. This is the nameless protagonist. Today, we'll be going over two concepts that I believe are very important, at least to me, and I would offer them to you for your own examination, both in concept, idea, and possibly in practice. This idea of Musha Shugyo, the warrior pilgrimage, and Nameless Path, the nameless path. The latter of which is more so my subjective opinion on my experiences with Budo, or the martial arts in general, as it relates to its iteration and expression from the island of Japan. Specifically in dealing with the samurai and ninpo arts overall. Aspects that I think, in my subjective opinion, have a much older root, going way further back to both Kemet and influences from folks on the outside. It is more so an examination, not of the culture, but an examination of human nature when put in the face of adversity. I'll begin with just a brief explanation of Musha Shugyo, its practice, its content, and why it seems familiar with this idea of Ronin, or the wandering samurai, the samurai with no lord or master. I'll make a few acknowledgments before we start, since we do have people in the chat here. McDrama Bear's here. Os, glad to see you. Toya the Texan. Os, glad you could be here. Miss Sunkissed. Os. Artisan MC. Also known as that Sasori Kage. Os. Chaos Rain. Os. Black Mind. I wonder if this is your first time here. Glad to have you here, fam. Os. The Unsunken One. Os. To Triv. Peace. Os. And Shango Zulu. Os. Glad to see you here. We also have a cash app from Black Mind. I appreciate you, fam. Definitely appreciate that message, fam. But we'll get started, beginning with Musha Shugyo. It is something you see often in story tropes. Many warriors, regardless of the culture, who have reached a certain point where there are things you simply can't learn within the training hall. A question of contextualizing the reason why you picked up a sword in the first place. Contextualizing the reason why you learn the art of fighting, whether it be through the way of the pen or the way of the sword. There's always a question of why. Many times, we find ourselves in positions to where we are born to these traditions, or we're placed in an environment where self-defense is paramount. And so we take up these things out of a sense of responsibility for oneself, or perhaps to protect others. But there still comes a time where you face a kind of bridge, and the question of whether to cross it or not depends on your meaning for donning these modalities in the first place. It is a kind of initiation, a point at which you have to take what you've learned in your training environment and go beyond the environment under which contextualized you and find new ways of understanding and relating to what you know. This is a thing that begins with the self. And this is a fundamental process of transformation. I believe that it's one that every human being does in some way unconsciously experience, but will find tremendous benefit in doing so intentionally within oneself. This is the idea of the Musha Shugyo, who would become the Musha Shugyosha, or a Shugyosha. To break down the words etymologically, etymology, I guess that's the word. The etymology of the word, I should say more specifically. Musha, this concept, Musha, the kanji breaks down to the specific essence of what makes a warrior. And this is something different from a fighter. A warrior, it represents an archetype that is embedded in the human soul, that relates not just to himself, but a culture and thusly a people to whom he is attributed to. It is a process of serving, not just to fight for the sake of fighting, that would be a fighter, but a warrior. It is an act of submission to the people from which created him. Oftentimes, there are rituals of initiation to make one a warrior. It is exclusively related to the concept of a people, one who fights for a higher idea. The idea of this, not by designation, but through the natural expression of what it means to serve. This is the idea of the warrior. Musha. Later on, this concept of samurai is animated from this idea to serve. In fact, the samu in the word samurai literally stands for one who serves, as a reminder to the aspect of warrior. In its core, unrefined form, Musha. This is the concept of that. The second part of the word, Shugyo. It is a derivative of the idea of studying. But when you're getting into these esoteric principles, there's a deeper aspect to one just simply intellectually engaging in a specific kind of content or material. When one makes a way of life something one observes and experiences, not strictly from an erudite sense, but in the way that one acquires wisdom through the form of experience with it, you submerge yourself in it. To give a comparison, one who merely reads about Kemet versus one who has surrounded themselves in the field, in the culture of it all, like Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinov. This is the difference between one that studies and one that is engaged in Shugyo, the true way of the student. It is a process that is ongoing and all-encompassing. It's when what you have studied eruditely becomes your way, and you are merely an expression of what it is you are studying. Thus, the Musha Shugyo is the warrior student engaged on pilgrimage to understand the way of the warrior. I think this concept is a very critical aspect of being human, especially for being a man, especially if you find yourself in the absence of initiation. This idea originally was very popular with many of the monks at the time who, in their quest for enlightenment, would travel all around from city-state to city-state, province to province, to attempt to learn and understand the ways of their teachings. Along the way, there were many principles at which they would adhere to. Some of them were as follows: to submit oneself to the elements. There are many specific ways that gets expressed and spoken out about. But it's interesting because when I look at much of the esoteric means of martial training, some of you have seen these concepts. If some of you are familiar with this intellectual property known as Street Fighter, there's a particular character in there named Ryu Hoshi. I suppose in the English translations, many pronounce his name as Ryu. He is a pupil of one of the great Shotokan masters in this intellectual property, known as Goken. They practice the art of Shotokan and its offset that deals specifically with the fundamental core energy known as the Satsui no Hado, the murderous intent. It is a fundamental understanding of human nature and the way in which it can be expressed, as one side had been made realized by the character known as Akuma, the other fundamentally expressed in Ryu-Hoshi. When you look to the means by which he cultivates his strength, when you look at the concept of what he does, he will state over and over again, the fight is everything. When you see him, he is generally in the elements of nature. Besides perhaps foot wraps, he's shoeless. He walks the earth barefoot. As far as his belongings, they fit in a sack, from which he carries along his back. Those are all of his relevant belongings. When you see him practicing his techniques, he is in nature. Maybe it is a plane. Perhaps he's lifting rocks. He may be at a waterfall, either meditating or learning to become one within himself. or using the very inertia and weight of the waterfall itself to cultivate and practice a technique. Akuma, or Goki, does the exact same thing. For a long time, as you see in the Alpha series, he's on an island all alone, contending with nature to cultivate his strength, to understand the way of heaven. There are no distractions. Both consider the idea of justice and injustice. Both concepts confront that which all appear to be adverse in all modalities of mind, body, and spirit. In other words, dealing with those darker aspects of human nature. They go to places that others would shy away from, whether it be places of great difficulty, battlefields, conflicts, people who are in need or not. In Goki's instance, he seeks out some of the most powerful people he can find and intervenes immediately to see if they measure up to his fist. For Ryu, he does something very similar, not so that he can destroy them, but so that he can come to understand the meaning behind the movement. He entertains people of all walks of life because everything can serve as a lesson. It's not the idea of trying to be the best. It's not the idea of trying to acquire trinkets. It's not even the idea of defeating others. The concept presented here is that there's no point in defeating others because victory and defeat is decided by one's own self. Thusly, one only ever really knows how to defeat themselves, not how to defeat others. The Art of War states that the greatest of warriors are not known for their cleverness. They're not known for great acts and deeds. They are simply skilled at defeating others who have already defeated themselves. It then questions this idea of win and loss. It's not the destination that one embarks on Musha Shugyo. The lesson is what's acquired by the experience of the journey. Every conflict, every struggle, every frustration, every single loss is a lesson. It's so long as you have a pulse, something which has given you an additional degree of understanding for who you are. In antiquity, moving away from that intellectual property, many samurai would move from their original posts and voluntarily embark in this state of being a shugyosha. Taking it out of its historical context, there are many who believe that this state was exploited in many times for the sake of passing on intelligence, we'll just simply say, as there were privileges allotted to people who acted in this capacity of Musha Shugyo. We've all seen the stories of the wandering warrior in various places who go from dojo to dojo, challenging the shidoshi there, making declarations such as, "I will challenge your students, and whoever is strongest, face me. Should I win? I own your school. Should I fail? My life is forfeit, or I will become your disciple." This concept was very, very, very important in creating a kind of circulation between various techniques of various ryu, or schools of martial science. It's in this way many concepts and techniques that were developed regionally spread to other areas of the island. And through this idea of Musha Shugyo, you get many such styles emerging at the top. It is unfortunate that during the Meiji era, most of this knowledge was purged, and many of the scrolls that kept this information disappeared into antiquity, some of which have been found recently. But that's what makes the martial sciences there so unique. This was a regular occurrence, and seen as just yet another part of your growth. Some samurai would begin this modality of training as a teenager and go from school to school, province to province, wandering. Like the progenitor of my particular style of the Nito Nichiryu, also known as Miyamoto Musashi. His work, the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, at its conclusion, holds a set of precepts known as the Dokudo, or the way of walking alone. For those of you who cover my channel, you've seen me go through a lot of these principles, and perhaps that may be how you've come to know me. Speaking more so to those in the playback. But if you haven't heard those, I highly advise and suggest, if you've the time, to take a look at those precepts that I cover in detail. The Dokudo stands for the way of walking alone, and it is specifically addressing the way one can engage with the concept and idea of Musha Shugyo. I think this concept is a useful tool to adapt because I see a lot of parallels to what caused this and its usefulness in modern life today. Currently on the internet, as we go through various means by which we communicate, many ideas are being brought forward, much like many different styles of fighting were back in the day. Concepts which you may believe in and hold true. It is useful to test them in various circles of thought to get a better understanding of your own predispositions, much like the samurai or the warriors of antiquity did precisely the same with their own martial sciences. In this way, they were able to discern what was useful and what was useless, and come to better understand themselves as a human being and better relate to the meaning behind the movements from which they study. With this in mind, I would like to transition and speak a little bit about the Nameless Path before I conclude. Before I do that, I'll make a few acknowledgments in the chat before we continue. I've got Greg that's made their way there. He says, "Oh, senpai. Oh, kohai." Glad you can make it, fam. Bet, appreciate you, fam. Definitely glad to catch you up here as well. I guess it's that time of day for you. Let's see. We've got Ray Hanma of the Hanma Force. Says, "Peace, brother." Os. Glad you can make it, fam. Lion 917. Os. Indeed, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakinov, underrated, misquoted, and underappreciated. Very underappreciated. 75 years of in the field study. 75 years. We've got Gold Professor, one of the elders in the space. Os. Glad you can make it, sir. We've got Doug. Os. Let's see. Drama Bear says, "Ryu and Akuma are my favorite characters." They are an interesting dichotomy, very interesting dichotomy, including their offshoots and variants. Chaos Rain says that must be dangerous form of martial arts, of all that might consume him in street. Oh, yeah, the Satsui no Hado. 2Triv211. Os. He says Akuma killed his master, Gotetsu. That fight was very interesting because of the conclusions. When Goki utilized the Shungoku Satsu and demonstrated mastery of the Satsui no Hado, he was happy. He was proud because it was, in theory, the highest form of its art. What gets interesting is later on when they get into the power of Mu, or the void, and the way in which that relates to all things. This concept of heaven, man, hell. Tenchijin. Maybe that can be another conversation when we get into some of the building blocks of Budo. It's an interesting trinity to explore and seeing how it plays out in everyday life. Lion917 says it was a good movie, by the way. That live action movie they did, I think it was done in the UK. Not the one with Van Damme, but the one that focuses around Gotetsu, Gokin, and Ryukin and Akuma. That is a very good live action one, and I'm glad they did it that way. They really stuck to the principles. It was about as good as the animated movie, which kind of went into a little bit of that. Black Mind says, I'd like to know more about Silat, if possible, martial arts from the archipelago. Yeah, there's a lot of folks in Southeast Asia that get involved with regards to it, and there's a lot of good info with it online. A lot of folks I know practice that with Arnis, the Filipino martial science. Very, very popular amongst a lot of the military community. Admiral Smoke is in the building. Os. Glad you can make it, fam. Definitely, if you guys have any questions, feel free to make mention of them in the chat, and I can move forward. But now I'm going to be bringing about the idea of the Nameless Path. What I'm going to do is read the beginning of this particular book I'm making, piece of fiction that is centered around a character known as Nanashi, which is coming to understand the way of himself as a human being. This is both the preface and prelude to the majority of the work that is being put forward. And the intention of this first portion is to lay out the foundation for the idea of the Nameless Path. A concept rooted in the idea of Musha Shugyo. All right, I got it pulled up now. And again, feel free to ask questions about this in the end or comment when it's done, because I think this is going to be one more so for the playback. But I'll begin. And it starts, quote, "The distortion amidst force and power is time. Their catalyst is strength. Strength can only be realized through one's ability to endure and overcome. Thus, adversity is the catalyst for strength. And so one must endure." End quote. Prologue to the Nameless Swordsman. End quote. I considered having a family to be the greatest joy, but for most, it is of the greatest misery. Men such as I find themselves in a position dependent upon a person who can take it away at any moment they so choose. They are all but slaves to their situation, and the whims of the individual who acts as a gateway for their legacy and the powers that be, who see them nothing more as resources to be plundered in the light of the technological revolution incoming. Has some other me in a prior point in the same place and time space in another multiverse experienced this dynamic? And it be an experience so profound that perhaps what I am experiencing now is the most conducive to my purpose as a means of saving me from myself? It would seem avoiding the dynamic of suffering, then, is impossible. At least the pain which serves as its harbinger, irrespective of the path chosen. This pain represents itself or presents itself as inevitable. I question, then, the return to the issue of purpose. Fundamentally, if all existence and consciousness is but a shard of the almighty infinite intelligence of the Creator, and we are to serve as a catalyst through which the Creator experiences itself, then this too must hold its own merit. This despair appears to be a prerequisite to my existence then. If its inverse is hope, and hope and despair are but polarities of the same thing, neither can be truly invalidated, only experienced by measure of degree and scale. As things appear currently, consensus by means of the aggregate still serves as the lens by which hope and despair derive their context and application. The paradox of the one who walks alone is one perhaps the vortex my life has been pulled into to experience indefinitely. The ever-longing desire to be within this aggregate, the ultimate knowledge that we are inseparable, yet on a fundamental, intellectual level, to be shunned by that same aggregate and seen as some disease for which there is no cure and mere presence might perpetuate. Some say to endure such suffering, but find one who would tolerate your presence would all but make it worth it. Such a person may indeed exist, yet the problem is uniting with them. What is one to do in the meantime besides sift through the misuse of the law of attraction and various means of hyper-accountability to place the faults of all your issues at your feet with the lowest of resolution and imaginary to concoct a solution? On the surface, it appears as a textbook means by which the issues might be dismissed, and the group might move on to procure the most it desires with the aggregate it has chosen for its own in-group selection. The eye of oblivion follows and bears its baleful gaze upon those who find themselves outside the sphere of acceptance within the aggregate. Yet I still walk on. I still endure. I myself am not sure why. Outside of this audacity which animates every single step I take in defiance of the aggregate's wishes. Perhaps it is here I have earned the mantle of villain. It is strange, though, that my heart seeks to serve this aggregate. I find no way by which to do so as I am. Thus transcendence, ascension to some greater state or deeper state, is required. Yet the fuel by which to attain those means rests within the aggregate, or so I've been taught. The risk of delving into oneself for the means of ascension strides headlong into the next paradox, becoming even more alienated from those from which you seek to integrate and attain acceptance. That then is perhaps the issue at hand, the seeking of acceptance. How rife with contradiction the one who walks alone's existence is. The superposition of solitude and unity are strong, and the song and dance of those who find themselves in that circumstance. I find that I must tread this line daily, alone, but knowing that had it not been for the people who rejected me, I would not be and refuse to disappear that they might be more comfortable and defy their will. To fully embrace this role of villain would defeat the point then, and so on many levels. Yet at the same time, donning the role of hero would be a false bravado, a grandstand to appease one's ego to be a sacrifice. Thus it would seem that suffering, despair, these things remain consistent and present at all times, devoid of the grandeur of perfection which paralyzes so many gateways, especially when the means by which to attain it appears so close yet so infinitely distant, as our very perspectives hinder us from reaching this idea of perfection. What else, then, is there to do but behold the despair and stare into the eye of oblivion? Yet I find myself releasing all fear, releasing all hope, releasing everything, and staring and state with resolution, come what may, and press on regardless. The purpose of my acquiring strength was to share it with what I hoped would be my family, to demonstrate that I held the ability to protect and provide. Yet the more I strived to attain this dynamic, the more it was made clear neither did I have the strength, nor was it a prerequisite for family. It all rests within the whim of the others who arbitrarily decide who shall and who shall not. For what reason, then, is there to even pursue strength, if this is the truth? I see no other reason than for the fact that it is possible. In truth, the aggregate may be able to defy me a gateway to which I am biologically predetermined to pursue, but it may not decide when and how I die. That is at least my ability to choose, irrespective of its will and desire to vilify me for this. Truly, the most iconic aspect of all of this effort in acquiring strength is realizing, in spite of how much one ever attains, always something, someone, somewhere is stronger. You forever will be lacking. Forever you will fail. There is no winning. There is only losing. The question of the usefulness of dichotomy of win and lose, therefore, is a matter of perspective and context. As such, I find no need for this idea of winning and losing. In my view, there simply only is. But if a dichotomy must be chosen, I choose then the way of failure. Such is the most natural accord of what is. As if one will ever attain perfection, one is permanently doomed to fail. And to be doomed is nothing more than to be fated. If one is fated to fail, is it not best to fail with one's grandest effort? To embrace the Tao of failure is to its greatest extent realize the full capacity of this idea of kaizen, or incremental improvement over time. And so, the path of dissonance is that which I tread, adherence to the Tao of failure. With the eye of oblivion at my back, I continue to tread forward, step by step, down this endless road as a warrior of despair. There is no control, only acceptance. There is no fear, but love. There is no hope for anything else other than what is. All is as it should be. What one may do is but respond to what is, and I intend to do so with the truest of honesty from within my heart. I hope that all might do well, yet that is for others to decide, as their will is their own. Just as they have their own free will, so too do I. Thus, I pick up my sword and embrace the nameless path. Quote, with resolute acceptance of death, endure through struggle, and find meaning through conflict. End of the prologue. There are many concepts that tie in with this idea of walking alone, dismissing the idea of win and loss, and to wholeheartedly accept the reality of what is. When one looks at the principles expounded upon in the Dokudo, the very first one is to accept things for what they are. And these words are stated very carefully, the key word being accept. And it stands in contrast to control. One can only control something which they fear. Yet one can accept, and so long as one's free will is not violated, you will find that your ability to respond appropriately to the scenario you find yourself in is much more appropriate, that you have much more freedom in your response rather than your reaction. The acceptance of what is not some means of giving up your own agency. It is, in fact, the very first step that's necessary in order to act freely. When you are in the midst of a fight, you can't control your opponent. What you may do is accept the disposition your opponent offers you. And from this disposition, you act in kind. When you understand what it is you're trying to achieve, your action in that very moment will be appropriate. If you're concerned with this idea of trying to control the opponent, knowing very well you have no means by which to affect their free will, you are actually giving up your ability to react, because you're placing initiative at the hands of your opponent, and they, in turn, are the ones controlling you. This is the idea of acceptance. It is not a declaration of giving up. It's not an excuse to not work as hard as you can. This concept of the Tao of failure, it's not a resolute surrendering of your accountability. It's not some wanton suicidal idea and assigning away of your agency to nihilism. It is an understanding that should you find a confrontation and you win in a single strike, it's not really a win. Oftentimes, what we gain in experience puts us in a position to progress along our path. What we classify as wins oftentimes are more so modalities that express some sort of stimulation within the ego. It's temporary, and it misses the reason why you picked up the sword in the first place, figuratively speaking. Each experience you come across doesn't need to be animated in this idea of win or loss. If you are breathing and your objectives have been attained, you have accepted and moved forward in the way, and you have become better than the you of yesterday. This is the idea of kaizen, incremental improvement over time. It reminds me of just a small anecdote. There is an axiom that describes one who is acquiring or desires to acquire strength. They are chained to a rock. And so they beg for the strength that they might free themselves from the chain. They're given the instruction every day to push against the rock and uproot it. And day after day they try, and this rock does not budge. First, it's only a few seconds. After a few seconds, they can do it for a few minutes. And time passes on and on. Every day they keep trying. A little bit more, a little bit more, and a little bit more. The minutes turn to hours. And after a few years, in frustration, they cry out again. I asked you for the strength to move this rock. I am chained here. What am I to do? And suddenly it dawns on them. They look down at the chain. They give it one honest, good tug. In an instant, the link shatters. And even though they didn't move the rock, they were able to free themselves from that chain. This is the idea of kaizen. This is the idea of becoming a stronger version of yourself of yesterday, so that over time you can become that which you seek to. That was a culmination of losses. Out of all the days, 365 times these things will be failures. To classify this as some sort of defeat is nothing more than authoring your own defeat. It simply is what is. What you acquired over time put you in a position to become someone that you weren't before. But you gave yourself the opportunity to become that by walking down that road, one step at a time. With regards to that, this is what is meant by the Tao of failure, and why I advocate the idea of it and dismissal of these concepts of win and loss wholeheartedly. It is a cliche to say that it's not about the destination, but it's something I fully believe in. It is the journey that matters. To be stronger than the you of yesterday, one step at a time. As Dieu also said in that intellectual property we made reference to prior, the fight is everything. Perhaps his ending in the first installation of the game, well, second technically, will make a bit more sense. The idea of Musha Shugyo, those who follow the Nameless Path, the advocacy of the Nameless Path. It's why I offer it here. For me, I see myself as part of a greater aggregate of those who originate from the continent of Africa. With this idea of Musha Shugyo, I see my experiences here in America with regards to the collective experience of mankind as nothing more than a training arc in the greater collective history, in the greater collective story of the continent. When you can see things from a higher point of view, such as that, certain things become a little bit trivialized in a sense. And not trivial in that they're not important, but contextualized in knowing where we need to be going and what lessons we need to learn from our experiences here. I believe our demographic, and those of you who hold a Y chromosome in particular, can benefit greatly from this idea of Musha Shugyo in the Nameless Path. I beseech you to consider it. Listen to what was said here again. Research the principles brought up and apply them to your everyday life. You are not here to defeat others. You hold the key to defeat yourself. All you can do is defeat others who have already defeated themselves. Your only true competition is with yourself of yesterday. In some way, in mind, body, and spirit. Every day, ensure that you are better and stronger, be it in mind, body, and spirit, than the you of yesterday. それが改善です. But the idea of kaizen, incremental improvement over time. With that said, we'll go ahead and conclude. I definitely appreciate your patience, and if there aren't any questions, we'll go ahead and wind this video down. Thank you guys for showing up this morning. And irrespective of what you do the rest of your day, I wish you well. To the space then. Os. To the founders. Os. This is the Nameless protagonist. And remember, 我々の道. This is the way.